Waldo. The act was billed as ballet tap, which does not describe it. His feet created an intricate timpani of crisp, clean taps. There was a breath-catching silence as he leapt high into the air, higher than a human being should, and performed while floating there a fantastically improbable entrechâteau douze. He landed on his toes, apparently poised, yet producing a fortissimo of thunderous taps. The spotlights cut, the stage lights came up, the audience stayed silent a long moment and then realized it was time to applaud, and gave. He stood facing them, letting the wave of their emotions sweep through him. He felt as if he could lean against it. It warmed him through to his bones. It was wonderful to dance, glorious to be applauded, to be liked, to be wanted. When the curtain rang down for the last time, he let his dresser lead him away. He was always a little bit drunk at the end of a performance. Dancing was a joyous intoxication even in rehearsal, but to have an audience lifting him, carrying him along, applauding him, he never grew jaded to it. It was always new and heartbreakingly wonderful. This way, Chief. Give us a little smile. The flashbulb flared. Thanks. Thank you. Have a drink. He motioned towards one end of his dressing room. They were all such nice fellows, such grand guys, the reporters, the photographers, all of them. How about one standing up? He started to comply, but his dresser, busy with one slipper, warned him. You operate in half an hour. Operate, the news photographer said. What's it this time? A left cerebrectomy, he answered. Yeah? How about covering it? Glad to have you if the hospital doesn't mind. We'll fix that. Such grand guys. Trying to get a little different angle on a feature article. It was a feminine voice, near his ear. He looked around hastily and slightly confused. For example, what made you decide to take up dancing as a career? I'm sorry, he apologized. I didn't hear you. I'm afraid it's pretty noisy in here. I said, why did you decide to take up dancing? Well, now, I don't quite know how to answer that. I'm afraid we would have to go quite a ways back. James Stevens scowled at his assistant engineer. What have you got to look happy about, he demanded. It's just the shape of my face, his assistant apologized. Try laughing at this one. There's been another crash. Oh, cripes. Don't tell me. Let me guess. Passenger or freight? A Climax Duo freighter on the Chicago Salt Lake shuttle just west of North Platte. And Chief, yes, the big boy wants to see you. That's interesting. That's very, very interesting. Mac, yeah, Chief? How would you like to be Chief Traffic Engineer of North American Power Air? I hear there's going to be a vacancy. Max scratched his nose. Funny that you should mention that, Chief. I was just going to ask you what kind of recommendation you could give me in case I went back into civil engineering. Ought to be worth something to you to get rid of me. I'll get rid of you right now. You bust out to Nebraska, find that heap before the souvenir hunters tear it apart, and bring back its decobs and its control board. Trouble with cops, maybe? You figure it out. Just be sure you come back. Stevens' office was located immediately adjacent to the zone power plant. The business offices of North American were located in a hill, a good 3/4 of a mile away. There was the usual interconnecting tunnel. Stevens entered it and deliberately chose the low-speed slide in order to have more time to think before facing the boss. By the time he arrived, he had made up his mind, but he did not like the answer. The big boy, Stanley F. Gleason, chairman of the board, greeted him quietly. Come in, Jim. Sit down, have a cigar. Stevens slid into a chair, declined the cigar, and pulled out a cigarette, which he lit while looking around. Besides the chief and himself, there were present Harkness, head of the legal staff, Dr. Rambeau, Stevens' opposite number for research, and Streibel, the chief engineer for City Power. Us five and no more, he thought grimly. All the heavyweights and none of the middleweights. Heads will roll, starting with mine. Well, he said almost belligerently, we're all here. Who's got the cards? Do we cut for a deal? Harkness looked faintly distressed by the impropriety. Rambeau seemed too sunk in some personal gloom to pay any attention to wisecracks and bad taste, and Gleason ignored it. We've been trying to figure a way out of our troubles, James. I left word for you on the chance that you might not have left. I stopped by simply to see if I had had any personal mail, Stevens said bitterly. Otherwise, I'd be on the beach at Miami, turning sunshine into vitamin D. I know, said Gleason, and I'm sorry. You deserve that vacation, Jimmy. But the situation has gotten worse instead of better. Any ideas? What does Dr. Rambeau say? Rambeau looked up momentarily. The DeKalb receptors can't fail, he stated. But they do. They can't. You've operated them improperly. He sunk back into his personal prison. Stevens turned back to Gleason, spread his hands. So far as I know, Dr. Rambeau is right. But if the fault lies in the engineering department, I haven't been able to locate it. You can have my resignation. I don't want your resignation, Gleason said gently. What I want is results. We have a responsibility to the public. And to the stockholders, Harkness put in. That will take care of itself if we solve the other problem, Gleason observed. How about it, Jimmy? Any suggestions? Stevens bit his lip. Just one, he announced. And one I don't like to make. Then I look for a job peddling magazine subscriptions. So, well, what is it? We've got to consult Waldo. Rambeau suddenly snapped out of his apathy. What? That charlatan? This is a matter of science, Harkness said. Really, Dr. Stevens? Gleason held up a hand. Dr. Stevens' suggestion is logical, but I'm afraid it is a little late, Jimmy. I talked with him last week. Harkness looked surprised. Stevens looked annoyed as well. Without letting me know? Sorry, Jimmy, I was just feeling him out. But it's no good. His terms to us amount to confiscation. Still sore over the Hathaway patents? Still nursing his grudge. You should have let me handle the matter, Harkness put in. He can't do this to us. There is public interest involved. Retain him if need be, and let the fee be adjudicated in equity. I'll arrange the details. I'm afraid you would, Gleason said dryly. Do you think a court order will make a hen lay an egg? Harkness looked indignant, but shut up. Stevens continued. I would not have suggested going to Waldo if I had not had an idea on how to approach him. I know a friend of his. A friend of Waldo? I don't know that he has any. This man is sort of an uncle to him, his first physician. With his help, I might get on Waldo's good side. Dr. Rambeau stood up. This is intolerable, he announced. I must ask you to excuse me. He did not wait for an answer, but strode out, hardly giving the door time to open in front of him. Gleason followed his departure with worried eyes. Why does he take it so hard, Jimmy? You would think he hated Waldo personally. Probably he does in a way, but it's more than that. His whole universe is toppling. For the last 20 years, ever since Pryor's reformulation of the general field theory did away with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, physics has been considered an exact science. The power failures and transmission failures we've been suffering are a terrific nuisance to you and to me, but to Dr. Rambeau, they amount to an attack on his faith. Better keep an eye on him. Why? Because he might come unstuck entirely. It's a pretty serious matter for a man's religion to fail him. How about yourself? Doesn't it hit you just as hard? Not quite. I'm an engineer. From Rambeau's point of view, just a high-priced tinker. Difference in orientation. Not but what I'm pretty upset. The audio circuit of the communicator on Gleason's desk came to life. Calling Chief Engineer Stevens. Calling Chief Engineer Stevens. Gleason flipped the tab. He's here. Go ahead. Company code translated. Message follows. Cracked up 4 miles north of Cincinnati. Shall I go on to Nebraska or bring in the you-know-what from my own crate? Message ends. Signed, Mac. Tell him to walk back, Stevens said savagely. Very well, sir. The instrument cut out. Your assistant? Asked Gleason. Yes. That's about the last straw, Chief. Shall I wait and try to analyze this failure, or shall I try to see Waldo? Try to see Waldo. Okay. If you don't hear from me, just send my severance pay care of Palmdale Inn, Miami. I'll be the 4th beachcomber from the right. Gleason permitted himself an unhappy smile. If you don't get results, I'll be the 5th. Good luck. So long. When Stevens had gone, Chief Stationary Engineer Streibel spoke up for the first time. If the power to the city fails, he said softly, you know where I'll be, don't you? Where? Beachcomber number 6? Not likely. I'll be number 1 in my spot, first man to be lynched. But the power to the city can't fail. You've got too many cross-connects and safety devices. Neither can the DeKalbs fail, supposedly, just the same. Think about sub-level 7 in Pittsburgh with the lights out. Or rather, don't think about it. Doc Grimes let himself into the above-ground access which led him into his home, glanced at the announcer, and noted with mild, warm interest that someone, close enough to him to possess his house combination, was inside. He moved ponderously downstairs, favoring his game leg, and entered the lounging room. "Hi, Doc." James Stevens got up when the door snapped open and came forward to greet him. "Hello, James. Pour yourself a drink. Oh, I see you have. Pour me one." "Right." While his friend complied, Grimes shucked himself out of the outlandish, anachronistic greatcoat he was wearing and threw it more or less in the direction of the robing alcove. It hit the floor heavily, much more heavily than its appearance justified. Despite its unwieldy bulk, it clunked. Stooping, he peeled off thick over-trousers as massive as the coat. He was dressed underneath in conventional business tights in blue and sable. It was not a style that suited him. To an eye unsophisticated in matters of civilized dress, let us say the mythical man from Antares, he might have seemed uncouth, even unsightly. He looked a good bit like an elderly fat beetle. James Stevens' eye made no note of the tights, but he looked with disapproval on the garments which had just been discarded. "Still wearing that fool armor?" he commented. "Certainly." "Damn it, Doc, you'll make yourself sick, carrying that junk around. It's unhealthy." Danged sight sicker if I don't. Rats, I don't get sick. And I don't wear armor outside the lab. Well, you should. Grimes walked over to where Stevens had reseated himself. "Cross your knees." Stevens complied. Grimes struck him smartly below the kneecap with the edge of his palm. The reflex jerk was barely perceptible. "Lousy," he remarked, and then peeled back his friend's right eyelid. "You're in poor shape," he added after a moment. Stevens drew away impatiently. "I'm all right. It's you we're talking about." "What about me?" "Well, damnation, Doc, you're throwing away your reputation. They talk about you." Grimes nodded. "I know. Poor old Grimes, a slight touch of cerebral termites. Don't worry about my reputation. I've always been out of step. What's your fatigue index?" "I don't know. It's all right." "It is, eh? I'll wrestle you. 2 falls out of 3. Stevens rubbed his eyes. "Don't needle me, Doc. I'm run down, I know that, but it isn't anything but overwork." "Humph! James, you are a fair to Midland radiation physicist, engineer, but you're no medical man. You can't expect to pour every sort of radiant energy through the human system year after year and not pay for it. It wasn't designed to withstand that." "But I wear armor in the lab, you know that." "Surely, but how about outside the lab?" "But, look, Doc, I hate to say it, but your whole thesis is ridiculous. Sure, there's radiant energy in the air these days, but nothing harmful. All the colloidal chemists agree. Colloidal fiddlesticks. But you've got to admit that biological economy is a matter of colloidal chemistry. I've got to admit nothing. I'm not contending that colloids are not the fabric of living tissue. They are. But I've maintained for 40 years that it was dangerous to expose living tissue to assorted radiation without being sure of the effect. And from an evolutionary standpoint, the human animal is habituated to and adapted to only the natural radiation of the sun, and he can't stand that any too well, even under a thick blanket of ionization. Without that blanket, did you ever see a solar X-type cancer? Of course not.